I command thee, spirit of the departed, arise, arise from your grave and reveal to me your secrets.
Lo, you have awakened me from my slumber. What is it you seek?
Yeah, hey, thanks for showing up. I'm researching my family tree, and I was just wondering, where are you in the 1880 US Census? Because I just can't seem to find you anywhere.
As family history researchers, we have all often wished that we could bring our ancestors back from the dead for a long but friendly interrogation. Unfortunately, that's not possible. When ancestors died, however, they were usually kind enough to leave future genealogists with one parting gift. Their death would entail the creation of several key types of documents pertaining to their life. You may not have realized that some of these documents existed, or you may have had trouble finding these documents in the past. Because Halloween is coming up and we can never get enough talk of the spooky and the macabre, this entire episode of the German-American Genealogist podcast will center around the subject of death and the genealogical documentation that an ancestor's death entailed. And since I'm sure you'll be getting enough treats this Halloween, I figure I'll use this podcast to give you some tricks. Tricks to locating death-related documents left behind by your ancestors, and tricks to getting the most out of these documents in order to benefit your family history research. On this episode, I am also going to be interviewing a genealogist named Janita Barringer Beals, who went searching for her grandfather's burial place and instead found something very bizarre. Janita is going to tell us how she solved this disturbing mystery, and why a funeral had to be held for an ancestor who had died 71 years prior. This is Josiah Schmidt, and you are listening to a frighteningly fascinating episode of the German-American Genealogist podcast. When attempting to pinpoint an ancestor's death date and death place, the first document that comes to mind for most family history researchers is a death certificate. Death certificates can be very useful because they often contain the deceased individual's full name, date of birth, place of birth, spouse's name, parents' names, date of death, place of death, and cause of death. Death certificates can also be troublesome to locate at times, in part because most states in America did not start mandating the public registration of deaths until the late 1800s. Before that time, some counties or even cities registered deaths on their own. Other counties didn't even bother to record deaths on the civil level because churches and synagogues were generally the institutions that kept vital records of births, marriages, and deaths. Even when county governments in America registered deaths in the 1800s, a lot of people, particularly in rural places, did not bother to go to the county courthouse to report their births, marriages, or deaths.
Hello, may I help you, sir?
Why, yes indeed. I expired earlier this morning, and I'm here to report my death to the county.
Please take a ticket and have a seat, sir. We'll call your number when it's your turn.
State death certificates are great if you can find one. You can look up the state's Vital Records Department on Google. Their website might feature a form that you can print off, fill out, and mail back to them, usually with a fee of anywhere between $5 to $30. When you are filling out the form, you will need to make sure you get their date of death and place of death exactly correct, because as I have learned when requesting state death certificates, even the slightest discrepancy will cause them to declare that they did not find a matching record, and you will be out the fee money that you sent them. Some state Vital Records Department websites also have a purely online form that you can fill out within your internet browser, pay the fee by typing in your credit card number, and then hit a send button, which can save you a few days in waiting time. The requirements for requesting state death certificates vary from state to state. Some states might require you to send in a Xerox copy of your photo ID. Some states might even require you to get your death certificate request form notarized, which might cost you an extra few dollars. Many states require you to state your relationship to the deceased, because even if a death certificate is 120 years old, state law may dictate that only an immediate family member or direct descendant of the deceased is allowed to see that individual's death certificate. This seems kind of silly, I know. If you write on a request form that you are the deceased's great-great-grandchild and are therefore entitled to see the death certificate, no one's going to make you prove it, but you really ought not to lie because that could get you into more trouble than it's worth. If you've ever requested a death certificate from a state Vital Records Department and come back empty-handed, there's no need to go find a cliff to jump off of. What you should do in this case is check with the county courthouse in the county where your ancestor died. It may be that they died before the state started registering vital records, and the county government may have been recording those events instead. Sometimes, even if a state government has started registering deaths, the county government may have continued to simultaneously record their own version of a death record as well. These county death certificates may be much easier and cheaper to obtain than state death certificates. Again, you can use Google to look up the county courthouse for the county where your ancestor died. These days, websites are like, well, we'll say opinions. Everybody has one. County governments are no exception. Virtually every county courthouse in America now has its own website, which will offer the contact information for the courthouse. If the county doesn't have its own Vital Records Department, you will want to contact either the County Recorder's Department or the County Clerk's Department. Some county courthouses may actually do a lookup in their death indexes for you for free. Others might charge a very small and reasonable fee. Others still might not have the staff to do genealogical lookups, but you can ask the courthouse staff if somebody like yourself can go there in person to look through their county death records. Before you load up your wagon and make the trek to the courthouse, ask the courthouse how far back their death indexes actually go. If you're researching an out-of-state ancestor and the courthouse staff can't do a lookup for you, you should contact the local historical society in that area, and they might have volunteers who can head over to the courthouse and do a lookup for you. If you don't have good luck getting at the county death records in the courthouse, you should try contacting the state historical society in the state where your ancestor died. State historical societies might have microfilmed or digitized records of the county death indexes, and they might also have volunteers who will do a lookup for you. It goes without saying that it's always nice, if a historical society does a free lookup for you, to send a little donation their way. Even $5 would be appreciated. From America's earliest days through the early 1900s, and even sometimes today, the most faithful recorders of vital records have been churches and synagogues. Places of worship were where people were baptized, confirmed, married, memorialized, and buried. They did the lion's share of work in creating and storing records for us genealogists of later years. If you're looking for a death record and you know what place of worship your ancestor attended or held membership in, try contacting that church or synagogue directly. Many of the earliest religious records in America have been lost to disasters or age, of course, but thankfully, genealogists of prior decades did a lot of work to preserve these old records, and with a little hunting, you might find a library that has a book of transcribed congregation records in the area you're interested in. Let's posit a particularly horrifying scenario. And say that you cannot find any death certificate at all for your ancestor. Well, fear not, because your ancestor probably left plenty of other records when they shuffled off this mortal coil. One of the, I think, most overlooked and underappreciated resources when doing genealogy, and especially German-American genealogy, are newspaper obituaries. Especially when the obituaries are printed in the newspapers of smaller towns in rural areas, they can contain a cache of golden information. Some of the most important pieces of information a newspaper obituary might offer are birthplace, birth date, maiden name, parents' names, date and place of immigration, earlier residences and migrations, marriage date, marriage place, names of current and sometimes previous spouses, date and place of naturalization, employers, church membership, death date, death place, cause of death, funeral home in charge of arrangements, and burial place. Obituaries may also contain the names, and maybe even death dates, of family members who preceded the deceased in death. Names, spouses, and residences of family members who survived them, and, one of my favorite tidbits, the names and residences of people who came to attend the funeral from a long way away, which can give great clues on finding long-lost branches of cousins. Always check at least 2 issues of their town newspaper that were printed after your ancestor died. If an edition of the newspaper was printed on the exact day of their death, check that one too, because sometimes the newspaper was able to report it on the same day that it happened. Older rural newspapers were not necessarily as organized and compartmentalized as today's newspapers are, so even if your ancestor's obituary doesn't appear on the same page as the other obituaries, read the whole paper. Your ancestor's obituary might have made front page news, or it might be hidden in the local happenings or neighborhood gossip section. There are many great websites, almost all of which require paying subscriptions, of course, that have digitized millions of newspapers, such as newspapers.com, newspaperarchive.com, and genealogybank.com. As a professional genealogist, I have subscriptions to all 3 and rely heavily on each of them. Google newspapers at news.google.com/newspapers also has a collection of free digitized newspapers that can come in handy for a researcher, although Google's collection comes mostly from large city newspapers. There are also smaller, more specialized websites, often hosted by universities or historical societies, that offer free access to digitized local area newspapers, such as nyheritage.org/newspapers for New York State papers, or the Florida Digital Newspaper Library at ufdc.ufl.edu/newspapers, just to name a couple. When searching online newspaper databases for obituaries, Keep in mind that your ancestor's name may have been misspelled.
Siri, open up my contact book. I'd like to make a phone call to my friend Zachary Mills.
Here's what I found on the web for grain mills.
No, Siri. I said I want to contact Zachary Mills.
Let's see what's up with the Buffalo Bills. Okay, this is the roster for the Bills.
No!
Online newspaper databases often use a program that looks at the image of the newspaper and tries to recreate a pure text version of the print. These original newspapers are sometimes faded or blotchy, so the text transcription that the computer program creates is probably riddled with errors. When searching for your ancestor's obituary on an online newspaper website, try as many different spelling variations of their name as you can. Especially if they were an immigrant with a non-English sounding name, try spelling their name phonetically, how it would have sounded when pronounced out loud. Also, if you know where your ancestor was buried, you can try searching for mentions in the newspaper of the cemetery where they were buried. Try searching for other combinations of words you think might be in your ancestor's obituary. Words like funeral, burial, died, death, survived by, interred, cemetery, etc. Don't rely entirely on web searches. Despite all of our advances in technology, sometimes the human brain is still the best tool.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
If you think you know the edition of the newspaper where your ancestor's obituary might have appeared, try pulling up the actual image of the newspaper and reading it line for line yourself with your own eye. Far from all of the newspapers in the country have been digitized, so just because you can't find a town newspaper online, it doesn't mean you can't get a hold of it. You may need to contact your state's Historical Society library or use Google to hunt for a large university library in your state, because these institutions often have newspapers on microfilm. You might then be able to make a trip to your state Historical Society library or university library and view old issues of these newspapers on microfilm. Or you might be able to go to your local town library and request an interlibrary loan of those microfilms from the larger institution. In certain cases, newspapers may have been neither digitized nor microfilmed, but the local library in the town where the newspaper was printed may store old physical copies of the newspaper, so you can try contacting the local library in the town where the newspaper was published. Try searching all of the different newspapers in the area, because often multiple newspapers in the same town printed different obituaries for the same person, each obituary with unique information. If you don't have luck finding a newspaper obituary for your ancestor in the town where they died, look up the town on Google Maps at www.google.com/maps. On Google Maps, you can find nearby towns that aren't too far away from the town where your ancestor died, and you can search for newspaper obituaries for your ancestor in those nearby towns as well. If they weren't too far away, and if it was lucky enough to be a slow news day, newspapers in neighboring towns or bigger nearby cities might have filled up paper space with obituaries from other towns' newspapers. My last point of advice on the subject of obituaries is to realize that newspapers were not the only ones who printed obituaries. You might be able to find an obituary that wasn't in a newspaper. If you've gotten a hold of your ancestor's death certificate, that document should probably list the funeral home in charge of your ancestor's funeral arrangements. Contact that funeral home directly. They might have stored an obituary for your ancestor. Contact relatives who might have attended this ancestor's funeral. They might have kept a funeral pamphlet which could have had an obituary printed on it. Find out what religious denomination your ancestor was a member of and contact that institution. Many churches and religious denominations, like the Lutherans and the Methodists, printed their own nationwide newsletters, and sometimes in these denomination newsletters printed obituaries after the death of one of their church members. We're going to take a quick break, but after we come back, I'm going to give you some real fun tricks on how to find and use cemetery office records and probate records in your family history research. And then I'm going to be joined by a genealogist named Janita Barringer Beals, who is going to tell us an amazing story about how her hunt for her grandfather's burial plot led to a very interesting discovery. Stay tuned. If you would like to advertise on the German-American Genealogist podcast, please click the Advertise with Us link in the podcast section on schmidtgen.com. Since we're such a young podcast, we have some really affordable prices if you would like an ad for your product or service to be featured in one of our episodes. Your advertisement will continue to pay dividends because these podcasts are archived, and everyone who goes back to listen to an older episode will continue to hear your advertisement. Contact us today to get started.
Hey kid, you know how many people are buried in that cemetery?
No, how many?
All of them.
When I was a kid, we used to play a game where every time we drove past a cemetery in the car, we would have to
Hold our breath and keep quiet as long as the cemetery was in view.
Well, I'm going to make a dangerous suggestion today, and that is that we should do a lot of talking in cemeteries, because cemeteries have records that have a lot to tell us. The inscriptions on tombstones can convey a lot of information, of course, and we should always make it a point to catch a visual glimpse of our ancestor's grave, just in case there's any pertinent information that's been chiseled into it. We can do this either by visiting their grave in person or by heading onto a website called www.findagrave.com, where thousands of online volunteers are working diligently to catalog and photograph every grave site and final resting place that they can in America and around the world. Keep in mind that every so often, tombstones are unfortunately engraved with incorrect information. So just because something is set in stone doesn't mean it's set in stone.
Hey Bob, we can get back to our neighborhood quicker if we cut through this graveyard.
I don't know, Fred. Are you sure?
Yeah, come on, it'll be a lot quicker.
Fred, did you hear that?
Yeah, I did. What do you think that sound is?
I don't know, but it's coming from the fog over there.
Look, Bob, I see a figure in the shadows.
I've got a bad feeling about this.
Ugh. It's just a man engraving a tombstone. Good gracious, man, you scared us half to death. We thought you was a ghost. What are you doing working here so late at night?
Those fools, they misspelled my name.
Beyond what is engraved on the tombstone itself, however, what many people don't realize is that cemetery offices keep burial files for everyone who is interred in the cemetery. These burial files are on paper or on index cards. Burial file cards almost always contain a little more information on the person who is interred there beyond what is engraved on their tombstone. Burial files in a cemetery office can also be useful for establishing relationships by telling you who purchased the plot that a given individual was buried in. These cemetery office burial files can also contain records of individuals who were interred in the cemetery but who don't have a grave marker. Without checking the cemetery office burial files, you might never know that these individuals were buried there at all. To request a search of the burial files in a cemetery office, you might contact the cemetery sexton if there is one, or you might have to contact the church or city that manages the cemetery. Even if a graveyard is a very old one and doesn't have a designated office, try contacting the city government, because they might have kept the old burial files for that graveyard. Finally, another commonly and I think tragically ignored resource are probate records. These are records that deal with what happens to a person's property and estate after they die. They can be found in the county courthouse in the county where the ancestor died. The most popular kind of probate record amongst family history researchers is the last will and testament, which is a very straightforward document written by the deceased, before they were deceased, of course, which names their heirs, usually their spouse and children, and delineates what property they owned. These wills are really fun to read because they give such a great glimpse into an ancestor's life, what kind of relationships they had with their closest family members, and what sort of things they valued. Other kinds of probate records you might find are administration records, orphans court records, deeds and land records, tax records. These kinds of records might seem a little boring at first, but they can provide you with a wealth of information on your ancestors and their families. Check the name of the person who was listed as the administrator or executor of your deceased ancestor's estate. It might be a brother or sister of your ancestor that you had previously not been able to establish a relationship for. Check the names of the people whom your ancestor deeded his or her property over to after they died. For instance, if you've been unable to establish a father-son relationship between John Smith and Peter Smith, but you see that after John Smith dies, half of his property suddenly becomes owned by Peter Smith, that can be strong circumstantial evidence suggesting that Peter Smith is the son of John Smith. Don't be afraid of probate records. Dig in, get your hands dirty, and feel free to politely ask courthouse staff for assistance when looking into probate records. Probate records are one of the often overlooked groups of records that were created by the death of an ancestor. Next up, I'm going to be speaking with a family historian who went searching for death records for her grandfather who had died 71 years prior, and she discovered that, shockingly, he had never been buried. As scary as that sounds, believe it or not, this situation may be more common than you think. Coming up next on the German-American Genealogist podcast. Your loved ones aren't going to be around forever. Have you ever wanted to sit down and ask your dad about his experience in the war, or interview your grandma to get her life story, but haven't been sure how to conduct the interview and how to ask the right questions? That's why I wrote my new book, 2,000 Questions for Grandparents, Unlocking Your Family's Hidden History. 2,000 Questions for Grandparents contains a manual on how to conduct family history interviews, as well as 2,000 questions on such topics as childhood life, memories of previous generations, world events, outlook on life, marriage and family, career and hobbies, spirituality and politics, likes and dislikes, travels and migrations, military service, and more. Purchase 2,000 Questions for Grandparents today at a special early bird discount on Lulu.com. You can find a link to the book in the Publications section at my website, www.schmidtgen.com. Today I'm speaking with an accomplished family history researcher and a talented writer who also, as luck would have it, is my great-aunt, or should I say my greatest aunt. Her name is Janita Barringer Beals, and I blame her in large part for my catching the genealogy bug about 10 years ago. Janita, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
You're sure welcome, Josiah. Glad to do this.
Janita, what first got you interested in researching genealogy?
What first got me interested in, I happened to come across some information on my great uncle, who's also kind of my step-grandfather, Lyman Barringer, his journals. And through a cousin, I was able to get some microfilm copies of his journals, and that's really kind of what we got going. And that was in about 2000. So it's about 14 years ago that I actually started doing family research because I wanted to find out more about who these Barringers were.
You mentioned Lyman Barringer. How did the Barringer family factor into the settling of northwest Iowa and Palo Alto County in particular?
Well, Lyman was one of the first pioneers to the Lost Island Lake area in Palo Alto County. He was the first person that voted in that county, and he documents a lot of that information in his journal. He came from Reedsburg, Wisconsin, or the Reedsburg area, and walked to Iowa and got himself a couple homesteads. And a few years later, then his father and his brothers came. But he came. He came the first time in 1871.
And who was Claiborne Barringer?
Claiborne is my grandfather, and he is the youngest brother of Lyman. He's quite a bit younger than Lyman. He was about 17 years younger than Lyman, as a matter of fact. He ended up in Iowa from Wisconsin. He was born in Wisconsin, but he came with his parents as a young boy to Iowa after his brother Lyman had moved. So he came in about 1873 or 74, someplace in there.
And how did he end up so far away from the rest of his family towards the end of his life?
In 1910, Cleburne moved with his family to Inverness, Montana. So my dad actually grew up in Inverness, Montana as a young boy. He was born in Iowa, but he spent most of his childhood in Inverness. And then Cleburne and his wife Eliza divorced, and Cleburne somehow ended up in Spokane. One of Cleburne's brothers happened to be in Spokane, so I believe that's why he went to Spokane, Washington, because his brother Charles was a banker in Spokane. But then the rest of the family, Dad stayed in Inverness, Montana for quite a few years. He ended up in California and then back to Montana, and then he went to Iowa where he married my mom.
Since you never got to know your Grandpa Claiborne personally, did your parents or relatives ever talk about Claiborne, and what kind of things did you hear about him growing up?
Because none of us kids knew him because he died before my mother and father were married, so my mother never knew him either. And because my father and Cleburne were separated by geography, they weren't separated, they weren't estranged from each other, but they were separated by geography. So my father didn't talk a whole lot about Cleburne. I do have some letters from Cleburne that he wrote my father, and it was obviously a very affectionate relationship, but they kind of communicated with each other through mail because they weren't near each other. My father really had a very close relationship with one of the other brothers, Emmett, and then also Lyman. He seemed to have a little bit of a relationship with Lyman when he was a boy, but especially Emmett. Emmett stayed in Palo Alto County, and he passed away, I think, in the 40s. So my dad had a very close relationship with him, much closer probably than his own father towards the end.
Can you walk me through the process of how you traced when and where Claiborne died?
Claiborne died in Spokane, Washington in 1931, and it was during the Great Depression. And Claiborne he had been a hail adjuster, and he lost his job, like so many millions of people did in that time. And he wasn't well. He was 65, and he wasn't well. And in the last months of his life, he wrote 3 letters to my father, and that's kind of how I know what happened during the last few months. He actually had to ask my father for some money to pay the rent. His rent was $20 a month, and he needed some help with that. And he had worked for the city of Spokane for $2 a day, 2 days a week, so that gave him $4 a week. It didn't quite cover his rent. And so he needed a little extra help. So my dad, according to these letters, my dad did send him the money. He thanked him in one of the letters. So I was really happy that my dad helped him out, because I know it was a hard time for my dad as well. I mean, the Depression was really, really tough on a lot of people. That's kind of where he was. He was basically penniless at the end of his life. He didn't have much, and he had remarried, and his second wife had left him at the time of his death. They weren't divorced, but they were separated. I always knew that he died in Spokane. That was kind of, I mean, I think my dad knew that. That was all brought to us. The deal with his death and how we knew what had actually happened to him was my second cousin, her name is Sherry. I've never met her, but she was also a researcher, and she was asking me where Cleburne was buried. And I said, well, I assume he's buried in Spokane in the same cemetery where his brother is. And she says, no, he's not there, because she lives in the area. And she says, no, I've gone to that cemetery. He's not there. And so I happened to have his death certificate, so I looked up his death certificate and went online, and I checked out the funeral home, and it was still in business at the same place. And this is 70 years later. And so I gave her the phone number for the funeral home, and Sherry called. And so a few minutes after she called, she emailed me with the information saying in her email, this happened to be April 1st, 2002. It was April Fool's Day. And like I said, I never knew Sherry before. And she emailed me, and she says, Cleburne is still at the funeral home. Well, I thought it was a joke, and this is not funny. It's, this is not a funny April Fool's joke. So I myself called the funeral home to see what was going on, just to see if she was telling the truth. Well, she was. The lady that answered the phone was well aware that she had just talked to Sherry, so she was really excited to talk to me. And she said, well, you're his next of kin. And she said, we had just entered all the hard copies of our records into a computer over the last couple of months, and so that's how she was able to pull up Cleburne right away. She literally walked down to the basement. When she saw that he was still there, she literally walked down to the basement, and he was sitting in a box on a shelf, and she came back up, and she was so excited to tell Sherry he was still there. So she was asking me what I wanted to do with the remains, and that was kind of shocking to me. What am I going to do with my grandpa's remains? I didn't even know they were still there. So we contacted my family, and because we happened to have a reunion in Iowa in 2002, we decided to bring his remains back to Crown Hill Cemetery in Ruthven, where his parents and his other brothers and his daughter, several people in his family are buried. There's a Barringer plot there. And we got with the city of Ruthven, and they gave us a slot to bury his remains. And in the summer of 2002, we had his service, and more than 50 people came, and not a single person ever met him that came to his memorial service 71 years after he died.
What was the exact process of getting Cleburne's remains from Washington back to Iowa?
They actually shipped him back. I think we paid a $75 shipping fee, and we sent him to I think it's Matisse Funeral Home in Emmitsburg, and they processed whatever they needed to do, and they did it for free. They didn't charge us anything. Actually, your grandmother, Lucy, is the one that, because she was in Iowa at the time, and she's the one that kind of coordinated all that. She was able to get the stone. We did pay for the stone, but both the funeral home and the city of Ruthven, they didn't charge us anything for the burial. All we had to pay for was the stone, which was really nice on the part of everybody, because it was just such an interesting story that they helped us out that way. When you bring somebody back 70 years after they die, I guess you get a little courtesy.
Yeah, a little post-mortem benefit. How did Cleburne's remains go so long without being claimed? Had anyone tried to find his burial place before?
Maybe. I think they just assumed, well, if it's not at that cemetery where his brother was in Washington, that it's someplace else. Nobody ever dreamed that he was sitting on a shelf. It was the first time I actually looked when I saw that he had been cremated. So that kind of raised, you kind of wonder with cremated remains what would happen to him. I absolutely know for a fact my father did not know that he was left there, because he would not have left him there. But because my father was not actually the next of kin, because he was still married, so his estranged wife was actually the responsible person. And because she was estranged, because it was the Depression, I'm assuming that nobody was able to pay for, the collection of the remains and the burial of the remains. My father would have done it, I'm sure, had he known that she didn't do it, that his estranged wife didn't do it. He would have taken care of it. So I think it was just a fluke, just a series of mistakes that he ended up with nobody picking him up.
Now, I know from my own personal research, that Cleburne's death did get a mention, I think, in the Ruthven, Iowa newspaper, but had you ever found a newspaper obituary for Cleburne out in Spokane, Washington?
I have not, and I think I did look at one time. I can't remember but I think I have looked, but I'm not absolutely sure if I've checked that newspaper. I used to subscribe to newspaper archives, but I don't recall if I have looked in Spokane. It would be interesting to know if there is an obituary, what they say. But it's hard because at the end of his life, I think that he was just really dejected. His wife had left him in the circumstances of not having a job. He wasn't well. He was having some heart issues. And sure enough, 10 days after he wrote his very last letter, he did die. He was not doing well at all.
How common do you think a situation like this is? Do you think that there are hundreds or thousands of Cleburnes around the country sitting in funeral home basements waiting to be claimed?
I think there's some. When I talked to the lady at this particular funeral home, she said I think there were 3 or 4, but Cleburne was the one that was there the longest. There was a couple of other ones that had been there for a couple of years. I think legally, she said they're only required to keep these remains for 30 days and they can dispose of them themselves. But they don't do that. They hang on to them. But, so there is just a window of time you've got to get them because legally they don't have to keep them, but they do. That was nice that she did. But yes, there are. I'm aware certainly of an organization. My husband's a veteran, and he has read up on some veterans being left at funeral homes, and there's an organization that's going around to funeral homes and trying to get these veterans so that they can have a proper burial. So yes, I do believe that this is not unusual, that people are left at funeral homes and they've been cremated.
What advice would you give to a family history researcher who is having trouble locating an ancestor's burial place?
And we were so fortunate with Cleburne, but I would check obituaries, newspapers. That's the best way to go. I have found some on the internet. The internet is really good with obituaries and that kind of thing, and that will tell you quite a bit. Walk cemeteries. Also go on Find a Grave. That's a great site to go on and find information. There's a lot of people out there that are taking pictures of grave sites and then posting them on Find a Grave to help other people find their loved ones. So I think that's a great tool, but it is difficult if you don't have all the information.
Thank you so much for talking with me today, Janita.
You're sure welcome, Josiah. Thank you.
I really enjoy doing this podcast, but I also enjoy researching genealogy for other people. My professional genealogy research services are available for hire on an hourly commission basis. If you have a genealogical brick wall and you'd like to get some expert assistance, please contact me at my website, www.schmidtgen.com. Well, if you're hearing this, that means you've managed to survive, at least until the end of this episode. I hope these tricks have given you some new perspective on the records that were left behind by our ancestors upon their death. I also hope you have a very fun Halloween next week. Until next Monday, should we be so fortunate. This is Josiah Schmidt with the German-American Genealogist Podcast. Auf Wiedersehen und gute Nacht.